You have one chance to do the right thing here.
And what do you think that is?
Tell them the truth before this all collapses.
Don't bother. Nobody will believe you.
The warning existed for only a few seconds on an internal system, long enough to be noticed by the wrong people and erased before it could protect anyone. Marcus Holloway had built his career on precision. As a compliance analyst for one of the largest transportation authorities in the United States, his role was not to make decisions, but to prevent disasters before they occurred. His work lived in spreadsheets, audit trails, and regulatory language most people never read. The responsibility was quiet, technical, and deeply consequential. When systems failed, lives were affected, even if no one ever knew why. The authority Marcus worked for operated under multiple layers of government oversight. Its executives carried federal credentials, security clearances, and the kind of institutional respect that discouraged questions. Publicly, it was a symbol of reliability and national infrastructure. Internally, it was driven by funding deadlines, political optics, and performance metrics that rewarded speed more than caution. Within that environment, warnings were tolerated only if they were convenient. The issue Marcus identified was not dramatic at first glance. It appeared as a procedural deviation buried inside a routine compliance review. A safety protocol had been reclassified, reducing required inspections under a revised interpretation of federal guidelines. On paper, it was legal. In practice, it increased risk. Marcus recognized the pattern immediately. The reclassification shifted liability away from leadership and toward automated systems that could not object. He flagged the deviation through the proper internal channel, attaching documentation and risk projections. His report was factual, restrained, and professionally neutral. It did not accuse or speculate. It simply stated that the revised protocol conflicted with established safety margins and recommended review before implementation. In a functional system, this would have triggered discussion. In this system, it triggered attention. Within hours, Marcus noticed his access privileges change. Certain databases became read-only. Audit logs that had been available minutes earlier were now restricted. No explanation was provided. The system did not notify him of any issue. It simply adjusted around him, as if anticipating resistance. Authority rarely announces suppression. It prefers quiet recalibration. By the end of the day, Marcus's report no longer appeared in the internal tracking system. The entry had been marked as resolved, categorized under administrative duplication. This classification effectively erased the concern without addressing it. The warning had not been disproven, it had been neutralized. In institutional language, this was efficiency. In reality, it was silencing. Marcus understood the implication immediately. His role depended on trust, and trust within the authority flowed upward, not outward. Executives with credentials and badges representing federal alignment were assumed to act in the organization's best interest. A mid-level analyst challenging that assumption, even indirectly, disrupted hierarchy. The system responded by restoring order. The pressure that followed was subtle but unmistakable. Meetings Marcus had regularly attended were rescheduled without notice. His requests for clarification were acknowledged but never answered. Performance metrics were updated, shifting emphasis away from compliance accuracy toward collaborative alignment. The message was clear without being stated. Compliance was welcome, resistance was not. What made the situation particularly dangerous was its invisibility. Marcus had not violated policy. No disciplinary action was taken. There was nothing to appeal, nothing to defend against. Authority had simply adjusted the environment until his warning no longer existed. This approach preserved deniability while achieving control. It was not punishment, it was erasure. Behind the scenes, the reclassified protocol moved forward. Contracts were finalized. Implementation timelines were accelerated. Leadership emphasized efficiency and modernization in internal briefings, framing the changes as progress. The potential risks Marcus had identified were not addressed because they no longer existed on record. Without documentation, there was nothing to mitigate. Marcus faced a choice that many in his position encounter only once. He could accept the adjustment, focus on his assigned duties, and allow the system to proceed unchallenged. Or he could persist, knowing that continued resistance would likely escalate consequences. The system had already signaled its tolerance threshold. Authority had shown its preference. He reviewed the data again, privately. The projections had not changed, the risk remained, the warning had been accurate, regardless of its classification. Marcus understood that the system was not designed to protect truth, only to manage it. Credentials, titles, and badge. EES created a hierarchy of credibility that favored decision-makers over data. What unsettled him most was not the suppression itself, but the confidence with which it occurred. No justification was offered because none was required. Authority assumed legitimacy through position rather than accountability. The misuse of power did not manifest as intimidation, but as certainty. The certainty that silence was safer than correction. Marcus documented everything he could still access, storing notes offline, aware that this alone placed him in a precarious position. Possessing information outside sanctioned channels was viewed as disloyalty, regardless of intent. Yet doing nothing felt worse. The system had made its position clear. The warning was inconvenient, and inconvenience had been eliminated. As he prepared to leave the office that evening, Marcus received a system-generated notification. It was brief, impersonal, and definitive. His internal submission had been flagged for review under organizational risk protocols. The language suggested concern not about safety but about compliance behavior. In that moment, Marcus understood the full scope of what had occurred. His warning had not only been erased, it had been reframed. The system was no longer evaluating the risk he had identified. It was evaluating him. What Marcus could not yet see was that his attempt to prevent harm had quietly positioned him as a liability, and the institution was already deciding how to neutralize the person who noticed what they were never supposed to see. In systems governed by power, credentials do more than grant access. They determine whose conscience is allowed to exist. Marcus Hollow. A did not experience retaliation as confrontation. There were no warnings, no formal reprimands, and no accusations he could respond to. Instead, authority expressed itself through reinterpretation. His actions were reframed not as diligence, but as disruption. The system began to treat his concern as a behavioral issue rather than a safety one. A shift that allowed leadership to neutralize the problem without ever addressing its substance. The authority's leadership operated behind a wall of credentials. Federal affiliations, oversight badges, and regulatory titles insulated decision-makers from scrutiny. These symbols carried an implicit assumption of competence and alignment with national interest. Questioning them, even indirectly, was perceived as challenging not just policy, but legitimacy. Marcus's report, though technical and restrained, crossed that invisible line. Internally, language became the primary weapon. Performance evaluation subtly shifted tone, emphasizing adaptability and alignment over accuracy. Marcus's insistence on documentation was described as rigidity. His requests for clarification were noted as inefficiency. None of these descriptors were false on their own, yet together they constructed a narrative that justified marginalization. Authority did not silence him outright. It redefined him. Policy became a tool of control rather than guidance. Sections of compliance manuals were selectively cited to support leadership decisions, while conflicting provisions were ignored. This selective enforcement created an illusion of procedural correctness. The system appeared lawful while undermining its own safeguards. Credentials gave leadership the power to interpret rules, and interpretation replaced accountability. Marcus attempted to escalate his concerns through secondary channels, believing redundancy would force acknowledgement. Instead, he encountered structural resistance. Each pathway led back to the same administrative logic. The issue had already been reviewed. The conclusion was final. Further discussion was unnecessary. Authority presented closure as efficiency, discouraging persistence without explicitly forbidding it. What became increasingly clear was that conscience had no formal standing within the system. Ethical concern was not a recognized metric. Compliance existed to satisfy regulation, not prevent harm. Marcus's mistake was assuming that identifying risk aligned with organizational priorities. In reality, priorities were shaped by funding cycles, political optics, and timelines that rewarded silence over scrutiny. Colleagues responded cautiously. Some distanced themselves, aware that association with dissent carried professional risk. Others offered private support without public acknowledgement. The culture did not demand loyalty explicitly, it incentivized survival. Credentials protected those at the top, while those below learned to adapt or disappear. Behind closed doors, leadership framed Marcus's behavior as a potential threat to operational cohesion. This classification allowed further restrictions to be justified as risk management. Access limitations expanded. Project involvement narrowed. His professional footprint within the organization shrank without any single action appearing punitive. Authority achieved exclusion through accumulation. The altered documentation Marcus discovered confirmed his growing concern. Portions of his original submission had been reworded, softening risk assessments and removing references to potential consequences. The revisions did not falsify data, they contextualized it into irrelevance. This manipulation preserved plausible deniability while undermining the warning's intent. What disturbed Marcus most was the ease with which conscience was overridden. No one denied the risk outright, they simply deprioritized it. Safety was acknowledged as important, but not urgent. In institutional logic, urgency belonged to deadlines and deliverables, not hypothetical outcomes. Authority decided which risks mattered by determining which ones were visible. The emotional toll deepened. Marcus began questioning his role within a system that rewarded compliance over integrity. He had entered public service believing that regulation existed to protect people. Now he understood that regulation often protected institutions first. This realization did not arrive with anger, but with disillusionment. Despite the pressure, Marcus did not withdraw his concern. He continued documenting inconsistencies privately, aware that doing so increased his vulnerability. Each note represented a refusal to conform fully. Authority noticed. Monitoring intensified, framed as support and oversight. The system prepared contingencies, anticipating resistance rather than resolving risk. Credentials continued to override conscience because the system allowed them to. Authority functioned on hierarchy, not ethics. Those with badges and titles were trusted by default, while those without were expected to align. Marcus's insistence on accountability placed him outside hat expectation. As the revised protocol advanced toward implementation, Marcus recognized the narrowing window for intervention. Once operationalized, the changes would become normalized, insulated by time and routine. Preventing harm required action before normalization occurred. Yet every path forward increased personal risk. The system had not expelled Marcus, but it had isolated him. His credibility was being eroded quietly, professionally, and legally. Authority did not need to prove him wrong. It only needed to render him irrelevant. As Marcus realized that his credentials meant less than his compliance, he also understood that speaking first had marked him permanently, and the system was now preparing to remove him before his warning could resurface. The price of integrity is rarely demanded up front. It is collected slowly, through isolation, erosion, and the quiet removal of everything that once made a person visible. Marcus Holloway did not receive a termination notice. Instead, he experienced something far more disorienting: professional disappearance. His position still existed on paper, his credentials remained active, and his name stayed on internal directories. Yet his role within the organization diminished daily. Assignments stopped arriving. Meetings no longer included him. Decisions were made without his input, even in areas where he had once been central. This form of exclusion was deliberate in its subtlety. It allowed the institution to claim neutrality while achieving the same outcome as dismissal. Marcus was no longer useful, not because his skills had changed, but because his presence complicated certainty. He represented an unresolved risk, an D systems designed to minimize risk tend to remove variables rather than address them. Financial pressure followed naturally. Performance-based incentives were tied to participation, collaboration, and project contribution. As Marcus's involvement shrank, so did his income stability. There was no explicit penalty, only the consequence of being sidelined. The system framed this as outcome, not action, preserving its image of fairness while delivering harm. The emotional impact deepened as isolation became routine. Marcus found himself questioning interactions that once felt secure. Emails were carefully worded, requests were measured. Every communication felt like it might be interpreted as resistance. The psychological burden was not fear of punishment, but fear of misinterpretation. Authority had made its expectations clear without stating them. Publicly, the institution maintained its image of cohesion and efficiency. Press releases emphasized modernization and progress. Internally, the same language justified consolidation of control. Marcus watched as initiatives he had once contributed to moved forward without acknowledgement of the risks he had flagged. The system did not deny his expertise, it simply no longer required it. Colleagues responded predictably. Some avoided contact entirely, unwilling to risk association. Others maintained professional courtesy, but no longer offered support. The culture discouraged alignment with uncertainty. In an environment where authority defined truth, neutrality became survival. Marcus was not shunned, he was deprioritized, a distinction that made resistance difficult to articulate. The reputational damage was gradual but persist. NT, in formal feedback, began referencing his difficulty aligning with leadership vision. This phrasing was vague enough to be irrefutable and damaging enough to follow him beyond the institution. In systems governed by credential-based trust, reputation travels faster than facts. Once questioned, it rarely recovers fully. Marcus attempted to seek external opportunities only to encounter unexplained hesitations. References were neutral but cautious. Background verifications took longer than expected. The invisible reach of institutional authority extended beyond its walls. Speaking first had marked him, not as incompetent, but as inconvenient. The most difficult realization was that none of this required malice. The system did not need to intend harm to cause it. It operated on incentives, and those incentives favored alignment over integrity. Marcus's situation was not exceptional, it was instructive. It demonstrated how dissent is managed in environments where authority equates stability with silence. Despite mounting pressure, Marcus did not retract his concern. He understood that doing so would offer temporary relief at the cost of permanent complicity. Yet persistence came with consequences. Leadership began framing his presence as obstructive. Human resources documentation shifted tone, emphasizing fit and collaboration. The groundwork for removal was being laid without urgency. Eventually, the institution presented its conclusion. Marcus was informed that his approach no longer aligned with organizational needs. The language was careful, non-accusatory, and final. He was offered separation under terms that avoided dispute. There was no admission of error, no acknowledgement of the warning. The system resolved the variable rather than the risk, leaving the organization felt anticlimactic. There was no confrontation, no recognition of what had been lost. Marcus exited quietly, carrying with him documentation he had preserved privately. The cost of speaking first was now complete: professional displacement, financial uncertainty, and reputational ambiguity. Yet even as he stepped outside institutional protection, something shifted. Distance provided clarity. Marcus recognized that his removal had not eliminated the risk he identified. It had only removed the messenger. The system had chosen continuity over correction, but continuity was fragile when built on denial. What remained uncertain was how long that fragility would hold. The revised protocol continued toward implementation. The warning, though erased internally, still existed in Marcus's records. The system believed the issue resolved. Marcus knew it was only postponed. As Marcus adjusted to life outside the institution that silenced him, events were already unfolding that would force the system to confront the consequences of the warning it chose to ignore. When the incident occurred, the system called it unavoidable, but the truth was far more unsettling. It had been calculated as acceptable. The failure did not announce itself with chaos. It emerged through disruption, delays, service suspensions, and a sudden shift in operational language that signaled something had gone wrong. Public statements described the event as an unforeseen anomaly, a convergence of factors no model could have predicted. Yet internally, the tone was less certain. Documentation circulated rapidly, focused not on cause but containment. The incident unfolded months after Marcus Holloway's departure. By then, the revised protocol had been fully implemented, normalized through routine. Inspections were less frequent. Safeguards had been redefined. Responsibility had been redistributed across automated systems and external contractors. The structure created distance between decision-makers and outcomes, ensuring that accountability would be difficult to assign. Immediate response teams moved quickly to stabilize operations. Their efficiency reinforced the narrative of professionalism. The institution emphasized preparedness, highlighting how rapidly services were restored. What remained unaddressed was why the failure occurred in the first place. Authority prioritized reassurance over explanation, confident that technical language would limit scrutiny. Internally, preliminary assessments identified the precise vulnerability Marcus had warned about. The procedural deviation had reduced redundancy at a critical junction. The failure was not random, it followed the path of least resistance created by policy change. Yet this connection was never formalized. Acknowledging it would require revisiting decisions already justified through credentialed approval. Official reports framed the incident as a rare malfunction within acceptable risk parameters. This phrasing was intentional. Acceptable risk implied foresight rather than negligence. It suggested that leadership had anticipated the possibility and deemed it manageable. The distinction mattered. Misfortune could be absorbed. Mistake demanded correction. Media attention intensified cautiously. Coverage remained factual, restrained by reliance on institutional briefings. Journalists referenced official statement. NTS, trusting the authorities' interpretation. The absence of dramatic imagery limited public outrage. Without visible harm, urgency dissipated quickly. The system relied on this dynamic, understanding that attention fades when impact appears abstract. Behind the scenes, leadership worked to align messaging. Talking points emphasized innovation, modernization, and resilience. The incident was positioned as proof of the system's ability to respond under pressure. Safety reviews were announced, framed as proactive rather than reactive. Authority sought to transform failure into validation. What was conspicuously absent from all documentation was mention of prior warnings. The internal record began at implementation, not evaluation. History was truncated to exclude dissent. This omission was not accidental. Records shape accountability, and accountability threatens stability. By controlling the narrative's starting point, authority controlled its outcome. For Marcus, news of the incident arrived through public channels. He recognized the details immediately. The sequence aligned precisely with his projections. The risk he had outlined had not only materialized, it had done so predictably. The realization was not vindicating. It was devastating. The cost of suppression was no longer theoretical. As external pressure mounted, the institution initiated an internal inquiry. Its scope was limited, its mandate narrowly defined. The goal was assessment, not attribution. This approach preserved authority while demonstrating responsiveness. Yet within the inquiry's materials a reference appeared. Brief, technical, and unexplained. It mentioned a discontinued internal review conducted prior to implementation. This reference caught the attention of a journalist assigned to follow the incident. The phrasing was vague, but its existence suggested omission. A review that preceded a failure, yet was absent from public explanation, raised questions. The journalist requested clarification. The response was delayed, then redirected. The institution underestimated the significance of that single reference. In attempting to appear thorough, it had inadvertently acknowledged history. The omission it relied on was no longer complete. Documentation, once archived, carries memory. Even controlled systems leave traces. Internally, concern spread. Leadership recognized that narrative control was weakening. The incident could no longer be framed solely as anomaly. Questions about prior knowledge threatened to surface. Authority prepared contingencies, anticipating scrutiny it had long avoided. Marcus observed these developments from a distance, aware that his involvement remained unofficial. His documentation existed outside the institution, preserved but unacknowledged. The system believed it had contained the failure. It had not accounted for memory beyond its control. As the journalist pursued the reference to a missing internal review, the institution faced a dangerous possibility that the accident deemed unavoidable might soon be exposed as something far more deliberate. No matter how carefully truth is buried, it retains a quiet persistence, waiting for the smallest fracture through which it can rise. The journalist's inquiry did not begin as an investigation. It started as a request for clarification, framed in neutral language and supported by publicly available records. The reference to a discontinued internal review appeared minor, easily dismissed as administrative overlap. Yet the institution's delayed response signaled discomfort. Silence, when paired with authority, often indicates vulnerability rather than confidence. As follow-up questions accumulated, the institution attempted to redirect attention. Statements emphasized ongoing safety reviews and operational improvements. The missing review was described as redundant, its relevance minimized, yet the explanation lacked specificity. In journalism, vagueness is rarely reassuring. It suggests something unresolved. Behind closed doors, leadership recognized the risk. The internal review referenced in the inquiry predated the incident and addressed the same procedural changes now under scrutiny. Acknowledging its existence would require explaining why its findings were excluded from decision-making. Suppression, once passive, now demanded active maintenance. Archived digital records became the next point of concern. Though officially classified as resolved, fragments of the review remained in legacy systems. Metadata preserved timestamps, authorship, and revision histories. These traces were not visible to the public, but they existed. Systems remember even when institutions prefer forgetting. The journalist filed a formal request under transparency statutes, carefully tailored to avoid triggering automatic exemptions. The request did not ask for conclusions, only documentation. Authority responded by extending review timelines, citing complexity. Delay became a strategy, yet delay also allowed scrutiny to intensify. Meanwhile, Marcus Holloway was contacted indirectly. The journalist had identified his name through archived compliance directories linked to the discontinued review. The outreach was cautious, respectful, and non-accusatory. Marcus did not respond immediately. Years of institutional pressure had taught him the cost of visibility. Yet silence carried its own risk. The truth he possessed was no longer solely his. As inquiries expanded, internal panic grew. Leadership convened to assess exposure. Legal counsel advised caution, emphasizing that partial disclosure could be more damaging than silence. Authority weighed options, balancing transparency against preservation. The institution had long relied on obscurity rather than deception. Now obscurity was eroding. The archived evidence, once buried, began to circulate internally, not through leaks, but through reference. Each attempt to suppress mention of the review required explanation. Explanation invited attention. The system found itself reacting rather than directing, an unfamiliar position for those accustomed to control. Marcus eventually provided limited confirmation. He did not share documents or conclusions. He acknowledged only that a review had existed and that concerns had been raised prior to implementation. This confirmation was enough. It validated the journalist's suspicion without exposing Marcus to immediate retaliation. Authority could no longer deny history outright. public interest increased cautiously. Coverage shifted tone, introducing questions rather than accusations. The narrative evolved from isolated incident to systemic oversight. The institution's previous confidence now appeared calculated. Authorities' credibility, once assumed, required defense. Internally, fractures deepened. Some officials argued for full disclosure, recognizing that continued suppression would amplify consequences. Others insisted on containment, fearing precedent. The divide reflected competing interpretations of responsibility. One side viewed accountability as corrective, the other viewed it as destabilizing. The evidence continued to breathe. Each document request, each reference, each confirmation extended its reach. The institution could delay, redact, and reframe, but it could no longer erase. The truth existed in fragments, but fragments accumulate. They form patterns. Patterns demand explanation. For Marcus, the process was emotionally complex. Vindication felt premature. Exposure carried risk not only to the institution, but to individuals who had navigated power under constraint. Yet the alternative, allowing suppression to stand, felt intolerable. The warning had been ignored once. Ignoring its aftermath would compound the failure. As oversight bodies became aware of the inquiry, pressure intensified. Requests expanded. Jurisdiction broadened. Authority faced the possibility of scrutiny beyond its control. The shield that credentials once provided began to feel fragile. The buried evidence had not erupted dramatically. It had surfaced methodically through process, persistence, and memory. The institution now confronted a truth it could no longer contain quietly. As confirmation of prior warnings reached oversight authorities, leadership realized that the question was no longer whether the truth would surface, but how much damage it would cause when it did. Power remains confident until scrutiny arrives from a place it cannot influence, and for the first time, authority realizes it is no longer in control of the lens. Oversight did not descend abruptly. It emerged through formal channels, measured and procedural, yet unmistakably serious. Federal review bodies acknowledged the growing concerns without spectacle, requesting documentation under statutory authority rather than public pressure. This distinction mattered. Public outrage could be managed. Independent oversight could not. The institution now faced inquiry from entities immune to its credentials, titles, and internal hierarchies. The scope of review expanded quickly. What began as an examination of a single incident evolved into a broader evaluation of policy interpretation, documentation practices, and decision-making authority. Investigators approached the matter without assumptions of intent, focusing instead on consistency. This neutral approach proved unsettling. Without bias to challenge, authority could no longer rely on reputation to defend outcomes. Leadership attempted cooperation while maintaining narrative control. Responses were thorough but selective, emphasizing procedural compliance over ethical consideration. Documents were produced carefully, reviewed repeatedly before release. Yet oversight processes were designed to compare, not simply discrepancies between versions surfaced. Language shifts became apparent. Authorities' confidence weakened as its own records contradicted one another. The credentials that once insulated decision-makers now invited attention. Federal affiliations prompted higher standards rather than deference. Investigators questioned interpretations that had previously gone unchallenged. The badge that symbolized alignment now functioned as accountability. Power discovered that visibility, once an asset, could become exposure. Internally, tension escalated. Departments that had operated in isolation now faced cross-examination. Responsibility could no longer be diffused quietly. Oversight demanded clarity, assigning accountability rather than accepting consensus. Individuals accustomed to collective decision-making now confronted personal scrutiny. Authority, fragmented under examination, struggled to present a unified front. Marcus Holloway was formally contacted as part of the review. The approach was professional, restrained, and voluntary. Unlike internal interactions, this request acknowledged his expertise without reframing his intent. His documentation, preserved outside institutional control, provided context that official records lacked. The warning, once erased, now carried evidentiary weight. The emotional impact was significant. Marcus was not seeking validation, yet recognition of his concern altered the narrative. The system that had removed him now relied on his accuracy. This reversal did not restore trust, but it affirmed reality. Power, when scrutinized externally, was forced to confront its own omissions. Within the institution, fear replaced confidence. Meeting S focused on risk mitigation rather than strategy. Legal counsel emphasized exposure over reputation. Authority recalibrated, not to correct past decisions, but to limit future consequences. This shift revealed priorities clearly. Preservation still outweighed accountability, even under scrutiny. Oversight continued methodically. Investigators identified patterns across unrelated cases, revealing consistent interpretation biases that favored expedience. These patterns undermined claims of isolated error. Authorities' defense shifted again, framing decisions as industry standard. Yet standards, when examined, varied widely. Consistency proved elusive. The institution's public posture remained composed. Statements emphasized cooperation and transparency. Internally, morale declined. Trust eroded. Employees recognized that scrutiny could reach any level. Power no longer felt distant or abstract, it felt immediate. Authority, accustomed to observing others, now experienced observation itself. Marcus observed the process with cautious distance. His involvement was factual, not adversarial. Yet he understood the implications. Oversight would not restore what had been lost, but it could prevent repetition. Justice, in this context, was preventative rather than corrective. That distinction mattered. As findings took shape, leadership prepared for outcome management. Consequences were anticipated, not yet assigned. Authorities still hoped to influence framing, if not conclusion. The institution had adapted to pressure before. This time, however, the pressure came from beyond its reach. The microscope remained fixed, revealing details once obscured by hierarchy. Power could no longer rely on assumption. Every decision now required explanation. The system faced a reality it had long avoided. Scrutiny was no longer optional. With investigators finalizing a sealed report, authority braced for conclusions it could not edit, knowing that once released, the findings would redefine who controlled the narrative and who would be held responsible. Consequences rarely arrive with anger or intention. They arrive quietly, carrying the weight of accumulated choices that can no longer be ignored. The sealed report did not seek blame in the way authority expected. It focused on patterns, incentives, and decisions made over time. Its language was restrained, clinical, and devastating in its precision. Where leadership had relied on ambiguity, the findings demanded clarity. Where authority had depended on hierarchy, the review emphasized responsibility. Karma, in this context, emerged not as punishment, but as inevitability. When the conclusions were shared internally, the impact was immediate. Executive confidence fractured as findings outlined how procedural interpretations had consistently favored expedience over safety. The report did not accuse individuals of malice, yet it left little room for denial. Repeated choices had created predictable outcomes. The system had not failed accidentally. It had functioned exactly as designed. Professional consequences followed methodically. Oversight recommendations required restructuring, reassignment of authority, and external monitoring. Leadership roles were redefined. Some responsibilities were removed entirely. These actions were framed as corrective, not punitive, yet their effect was unmistakable. Careers built on unquestioned authority now faced limits imposed by accountability. For those who had relied most heavily on credentials, the shift was disorienting. Badges and titles no longer provided insulation. Decisions, once protected by institutional confidence, were now scrutinized individually. Power discovered that longevity did not guarantee immunity. The past, carefully managed for years, had resurfaced through documentation rather than memory. Marcus Holloway observed the fallout with complex emotions. There was no satisfaction in seeing authority constrained, only confirmation. The system that had silenced him was now acknowledging the very risks it had dismissed. His warning had not prevented the incident, but it had shaped the reckoning. Karma did not require his participation. It unfolded regardless. The institution's response emphasized reform. Policies were revised, review protocols strengthened, oversight mechanisms expanded. These changes were presented as evolution, yet their necessity underscored failure. Authority adapted because it had to, not because it chose to. The distinction lingered beneath official language. Public disclosure followed selectively. The institution released summaries that highlighted commitment to safety and transparency. Specific failures were contextualized. Accountability was acknowledged without emphasis. This careful framing aimed to preserve trust while conceding error. Karma, however, had already altered internal dynamics in ways public messaging could not fully conceal. Within the organization, culture shifted. Silence became less reliable. Documentation carried new weight. Decisions required justification rather than assumption. Author: IT could still function, but it no longer operated unchecked. The memory of exposure influenced behavior more effectively than policy alone. Marcus's professional standing remained uncertain. The review validated his analysis, yet it did not restore his position. Justice corrected the record but did not reverse displacement. This outcome reflected a broader truth. Accountability addresses systems more readily than individuals. Karma balanced scales unevenly, redistributing power rather than repairing damage. Yet the emotional burden Marcus carried began to lift incrementally. He no longer questioned his judgment or integrity. The system's acknowledgement, however limited, confirmed that his concern had been legitimate. Vindication arrived without celebration, shaped by restraint rather than triumph. For leadership, the reckoning was ongoing. Oversight demanded progress reports, compliance audits, and transparency benchmarks. Authority learned that consequences were not a moment, but a condition. Karma did not conclude, it persisted. Every future decision would now be measured against past exposure. The most profound shift occurred in how power perceived itself. Confidence gave way to caution, certainty to review. The badge that once symbolized control now represented responsibility. Authority could no longer assume alignment with justice. It had to demonstrate it. As reforms took effect, attention began to fade. Public focus moved on, as it often does, yet within the institution memory remained. The knowledge that silence had consequences altered behavior more effectively than any mandate. Marcus stood at a crossroads, aware that truth had cost him deeply but also reshaped the system that dismissed him. Karma had not restored what he lost, but it had ensured that loss was not meaningless. The warning had been ignored once. It would not be ignored again. As the institution prepared to close the case publicly, one unresolved question lingered: whether acknowledging failure was enough, or if true justice demanded confronting how easily power could repeat the same mistake. The system declared the matter resolved. But resolution does not erase what has already been lived, nor does it guarantee that the same power will not fail again. The case reached its official conclusion without ceremony. Oversight reports were finalized, recommendations accepted, and corrective measures documented. From an administrative perspective, the issue was closed. Authority framed the outcome as evidence of institutional strength, proof that safeguards worked when activated. The language was deliberate, emphasizing learning rather than failure, adjustment rather than accountability. Public acknowledgement followed a familiar pattern. Statements highlighted reforms, oversight cooperation, and renewed commitment to safety. Specific decisions were contextualized within broader operational challenges. The narrative avoided personalization, focusing instead on process. This approach preserved credibility while limiting exposure. Authority conceded enough to move forward, but not enough to invite deeper examination. Internally, the changes were real, though uneven. Review protocols became stricter. Documentation standards tightened. Decision-making authority was redistributed to reduce unilateral interpretation. These measures altered workflow and culture incrementally. Employees adjusted, aware that scrutiny now lingered where assumption once prevailed. The system had learned, but learning came through consequence rather than choice. For Marcus Holloway, closure arrived without restoration. His analysis had been validated, his warning confirmed, yet his displacement remained. The institution did not offer reintegration or acknowledgement. Justice corrected the record boot. T did not reverse the cost of speaking first. This outcome underscored a hard truth. Systems repair themselves more readily than they repair individuals. Marcus rebuilt quietly. He redirected his expertise toward environments that valued caution over speed. His perspective had changed permanently. Authority was no longer abstract or benevolent in his mind. It was conditional, capable of both protection and harm. This understanding guided his future decisions, grounding them in vigilance rather than trust. The institution, meanwhile, returned to operation. New initiatives replaced old ones. Leadership adjusted to oversight requirements, integrating them into routine. Over time, urgency faded, memory softened. The risk that had once demanded attention became historical reference. Systems are efficient at moving forward, even when lessons are incomplete. What remained unresolved was not the incident itself, but the conditions that allowed it. Authority continued to rely on hierarchy, credentials, and interpretation. Safeguards existed, but their activation still depended on individuals willing to challenge certainty. The reforms addressed symptoms, not incentives. Silence remained safer than dissent in subtle ways. Public trust stabilized, supported by distance and distraction. Without ongoing visibility, accountability receded from attention. The institution counted this as success, yet success measured by quiet does not equate to justice. It merely indicates absence of pressure. The system had learned to respond, not necessarily to prevent. Marcus understood this distinction. His experience taught him that exposure corrects outcomes, but it does not eliminate risk. Power adapts. It absorbs lessons selectively. Without continuous challenge, it reverts to efficiency over integrity. The badge, whether literal or symbolic, still carried authority capable of misuse. The observer who initiated scrutiny remained unnamed, absorbed into process. Courage was anonymized, folded into policy language. This omission preserved structure while discouraging individual accountability. The system preferred reform without recognition. It learned from dissent without rewarding it. As time passed, the case became reference material, cited internally as precedent. It served as cautionary example, not catalyst. Authority acknowledged its limits theoretically while preserving them practically. The lesson was documented, but not fully internalized. Marcus did not seek further confrontation. His role was no longer oppositional. Yet he remained attentive, aware that systems forget what they do not revisit. Justice had occurred, but it was bounded. Karma had balanced scales partially, not completely. The cost remained asymmetrical. The system learned, but it learned too late to prevent harm, too narrowly to ensure permanence. Its correction addressed what was visible, not what was embedded. Authority adjusted behavior, not identity. This distinction defined the ending not as resolution but as warning. The story did not conclude with triumph or collapse. It settled into uncertainty, where accountability existed but required vigilance. The system moved forward, wiser yet unchanged at its core. Marcus moved forward as well, carrying knowledge earned through loss. The case was closed, reforms implemented, and records corrected. But as authority resumed its rhythm, one question remained unanswered. Had the system truly changed, or had it simply learned how to bury the next warning more carefully?